Thank you. Thank you, Martin, for this very lucid presentation. Thank you also for giving it to us in English, and I doubt whether it could have been any more elaborate and enlightening had you done it in Persian, even though you would have had 20% more time to do so. Thank you very much. הדובר הבא הוא גארי סיימור. גארי סיימור הוא סגן הנשיא, מנהל המחקרים ויושב ראש קרן מוריס גרינברג במועצה ליחסי חוץ, Council of Foreign Relations. דוקטור סיימור שמתמחה בתפוצה גרעינית, כתוב פה שהוא מתמחה בתפוצה גרעינית ובבקרת נשק. השאלה אם הוא עוסק בזה או מתמחה בזה, אנחנו נשמע בעוד כמה דקות. הוא עבד עבור ממשלת ארצות הברית במחלקת המדינה ובמועצה לביטחון לאומי. גארי סיימור עבד גם במכון למחקרים אסטרטגיים ובאוניברסיטת הרווארד. בבקשה.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm afraid I have no choice but to speak in English, so you'll have to bear with me. What I'd like to do is focus most of my remarks on the diplomatic options available to President Obama to try to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability in terms of being able to produce large quantities of weapons-grade nuclear materials. But then I'd like to conclude by discussing, at least briefly, what the options will be if those diplomatic efforts fail, because I think the previous speakers are right. We have to be realistic and accept the possibility that we may not be able to stop Iran through diplomatic means. Let me begin by just discussing the situation that President Obama will face when he takes office in January. For 3 years now, under President Bush, the U.S. has in fact employed a classic carrot and stick diplomatic strategy to try to halt or slow down Iran's nuclear program. On the stick side, Washington has joined with an international coalition of big powers, the so-called EU 3+3, or other people call it the P5+1, in an effort to impose political pressure and economic sanctions against Iran to convince Iran to suspend its enrichment program as a condition for beginning multinational nuclear negotiations. On the carrot side, the U.S. has offered to support, I would say, a very generous offer from the international coalition to support Iran's civil nuclear power program, including guarantees of fuel supply and access to modern nuclear technology, if Iran agrees to a 10-year moratorium on its enrichment program. Unfortunately, as we all know, that strategy has failed. Iran has ignored international pressures, and it's continued its enrichment program in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions. At this point, Iran has basically mastered the P1 centrifuge technology that it obtained from Pakistan about 20 years ago, and Iran has now embarked on a program to build up its bank of centrifuges, its number of centrifuges, and its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. And eventually this will create an option for Iran to produce enough highly enriched uranium quickly enough to support a nuclear weapons program, so-called nuclear breakout. Now, in my view, Iran is still probably a few years away from having a credible breakout option in terms of being confident that it can produce large quantities of weapons-grade material quickly enough before any action could be taken to prevent it. But this is really a political judgment. It's not a technical judgment. The Iranians at some point will have to make a decision what is a safe period of time for them to move. If they make a political decision to build nuclear weapons, they'll have to decide what is the safe period where they can be confident they can be successful before action can be taken against them. And that's a judgment they'll have to make. But in any event, it's clear that time is working to Iran's benefit. And even worse, I think there's a growing sense in the region and more broadly that Iran's nuclear effort is unstoppable. So the Obama administration will be under pressure, first of all, to reverse this defeatist tendency, and secondly, to try to take action diplomatically to change the status quo. based on statements that have been made already by President-elect Obama and his advisors, such as the one that Ambassador Cunningham quoted, I think it's very likely that the new administration will attempt some variation on the existing diplomatic strategy, but they'll try to develop and employ bigger carrots and bigger sticks in order to convince Iran's leaders to curb their enrichment program in exchange for receiving benefits and avoiding punishments. I think there are three reasons why Obama might succeed where Bush has failed. First and most important is the collapse in world oil prices, which I think has made Iran more vulnerable to the threat of economic sanctions and increased public discontent with the really disastrous economic policies of President Ahmadinejad. So to some extent, the Iranians might be more inclined to seek a diplomatic solution if they believe the alternative could increase public opposition to the regime, which is already suffering a number of very difficult economic hardships. If nothing else, Iran's economic troubles gives the U.S. and its allies a stronger argument with reluctant countries that sanctions are worth another try, and they might be successful at $50 a barrel oil, even though they failed at $150 barrel oil. Second, I think the Obama administration will be in a stronger position to credibly offer a genuine improvement in U.S.-Iranian relations if the nuclear issue is resolved. The Bush administration's effort in this area, I think, was severely weakened by internal disagreements on whether and on how to engage Iran. In contrast, I think the Obama administration will be less hampered by these internal divisions. It is more likely to propose to begin direct, unconditional talks with Iran on a range of issues as part of an effort to get multinational nuclear talks started. And in such talks, I expect the administration will be willing to offer improvement in bilateral and political, both economic and political relations with Iran if it agrees to curb its nuclear program. By making these offers public, the U.S. might be able to generate internal pressure among those elements of the Iranian public and elite that would genuinely prefer better relations with the United States. And third, and I think most challenging for a successful diplomatic strategy, the Obama administration will need to line up support for much stronger sanctions to pressure Iran to suspend its enrichment program while negotiations take place and to eventually accept serious limits if a nuclear deal can be reached. In contrast to President Bush, I think Obama's popularity in Europe will give him a stronger political base, at least during the honeymoon period, to appeal to reluctant governments and publics to impose stronger financial and other sanctions against Iran beyond those mandated by the Security Council. Getting Russia and China to support stronger UN sanctions will unfortunately be much more difficult because I think Moscow and Beijing basically don't share our concern about Iran's nuclear program, and at least so far they haven't been willing to seriously jeopardize their bilateral relations with Iran for the sake of trying to stop its nuclear weapons efforts. Nonetheless, the Obama administration will have a fresh chance to strike a new deal with Russia, as other speakers have discussed. For example, by offering to abandon missile defense in Europe if Russia works with the United States to halt Iran's enrichment program. Another element of a successful diplomatic strategy will be the credible threat of force if diplomacy fails. This will be a challenge for the Obama administration, but as Martin Kramer suggested, President Obama may be in a position to make a credible argument for using force if diplomacy fails. He may be in a stronger position than President Bush because of his ability to appeal to world opinion, including in the Arab world. And I think the threat of using force actually increases if the U.S. is able to begin to withdraw its forces from Iraq in an orderly way. So that may give the Iranian leadership more pause about the potential consequences if they turn down an offer from the United States. Well, I've made the argument for why the Obama administration can play a stronger diplomatic hand. But I also think we have to be realistic that stopping Iran at this point is going to be a very difficult challenge. Right now, Iran's leadership appears to believe they're in a strong position to pursue their nuclear ambitions within acceptable risks, and I think they probably value the acquisition of a nuclear weapons capability much more than better relations with the United States. In fact, some of Iran's leaders probably prefer a hostile relationship with the U.S. because it gives them better opportunities to try to mobilize regional opposition to the U.S. and justifies repressive measures at home. Furthermore, broadening the agenda of the discussions between the U.S. and Iran to include a range of other issues may actually make a solution more difficult because there are real limits on the extent to which the U.S. can recognize Iran's position in the region as part of a nuclear deal. Under these circumstances, Tehran's natural instincts will be to drag out the negotiations with various diversions and hints of concessions, something they're very good at, while they continue to build up their enrichment capacity. As Chairman Berman suggested this morning, the U.S. will probably need to declare a deadline at some point in order to force Iran to choose between suspending enrichment or face stronger sanctions. It's important to remember here that the near-term objective of engagement is not a comprehensive agreement. That would probably take years to negotiate. The immediate objective is mutual suspension. Iran suspends enrichment activities, the U.S. and the international coalition suspend sanctions, and that creates political space to try to negotiate a permanent agreement. So we have to keep our eyes focused on that tactical objective as the one that's plausible to achieve, rather than an overall solution, which I think is probably not something that one could reasonably expect in the near term. Now, Iran is certain to resist U.S. efforts to end or delay for a long period of time its enrichment program. I think there will be some temptation in the United States to seek a technical solution that would accept some limited enrichment in Iran, but with technical and political constraints to make it more difficult for Iran to break out and produce nuclear weapons. For example, one could try to limit the number of centrifuge machines or the size of the stockpile of low-enriched uranium that the Iranians have on hand. Now, such a technical compromise sounds good on paper, but I don't think it exists in reality because I see no evidence that Iran is willing to accept meaningful constraints on its enrichment program beyond those required by the NPT. And furthermore, any agreement along these lines runs the risk of really legitimizing Iran's enrichment program while putting Iran in a stronger position to renege or cheat on the deal when they think it's safe to do so. So in the end, if the diplomatic effort fails, the U.S. will be left with two very unappealing options. On one hand, the U.S. can revert to a strategy of containment and deterrence, trying to weaken Iran with long-term sanctions, slow its nuclear development through interdiction and export controls, and, as we've heard, trying to deter Iran from using nuclear weapons or pursuing more aggressive policies by offering nuclear guarantees and enhanced defense cooperation with American allies in the region. On the other hand, the U.S. can attack Iran's nuclear facilities to delay, set back their technical progress, and reset the diplomatic clock. In choosing between these two unappealing options, I think the U.S. will take three factors into consideration. First, what is the expected utility of a military attack in terms of how much damage will it inflict and how long would it take Iran to rebuild? And this calculation will need to take into account the possibility that Iran has covert facilities and that Iran has presumably taken precautionary measures to stockpile materials and equipment so that it can rebuild in the aftermath of an attack. Second, what are the risks of a military attack? Martin Kramer discussed the risks in terms of broader regional instability, but I think the more immediate question will be, what will Iran's retaliation be? Will Iran be cautious and confine itself to limited retaliation through proxies and covert action, or will Iran take steps that leads to a broader military conflict, which could include direct attacks on the U.S. and its allies and potentially disrupt oil production and shipping? And third, what are the risks of not acting? Dr. Khan discussed these. Is it possible to erect barriers to keep Iran below the threshold of actually building nuclear weapons, or is it inevitable that Iran will eventually choose to exercise its nuclear option once it is available? If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, how effective can deterrence be to prevent use or transfer of nuclear weapons? What is the risk of accidental or unauthorized use or transfer? Can we manage the threat of further proliferation in the region if Iran has nuclear weapons? Now, I don't think actually it's possible to answer any of these questions with high confidence, but these are the kinds of issues that will be taken into consideration when a decision is made between the two unappetizing choices of either trying to manage Iran with a bomb or bombing Iran. Obviously, it's far better to avoid this choice, and as I've suggested, I think there's a good case to make that the Obama administration is in a better position than the Bush administration to mount an effective diplomatic strategy to halt or at least delay Iran's enrichment program by offering more attractive inducements and, even more important, by threatening more effective punishments. Thank you very much.